We should be live. So, hello, thank you to everyone who's watching our stream and to all of our participants who are going to be working together to talk about crypto hacks and the security lessons that we can learn from them. So before we get into the content, let's do intros. I'm Jessica Levesque. I'm C4's executive director, and I am joined today by a room, we'll call this a room, a virtual room of cryptocurrency and security experts. So Dirk, do you want to get us started with introducing yourself, please?
Sure. I'm Dirk Anderson. I'm the chair of the CCSS committee and longtime traditional information security professional who moved into the crypto and digital asset world a few years back.
I love how a few years back is like 9 years now, something like that. Is that
It's
a
getting
long
to
time?
be, yeah, it's getting to be a lot more than I thought it was. But
Yeah, time flies. Okay, Michael.
Yeah, hi. I'm Michael Niemeier. I'm a junior audit partner at CertIC. I've been there for about 4 years now. Before that, I got my doctorate in mathematics and was teaching mathematics, but then started investing in the crypto space and realized there was a lot of scary things happening. Decided to look into it and then made a career change. So here I am.
Okay. All right, love it. Thank you. Dave.
Sure. Dave Schwed. Spent most of my career in large regulated financial service organizations. From a crypto perspective, I was the CISO over Galaxy Digital, global head of digital assets technology for BNY Mellon, CISO over Robinhood, supporting their brokerage, money, and banking businesses. And I was also the chief operating officer of Hellborn, and currently I'm the chief operating officer of Savr.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you for joining us. And Dmytro.
Hello, thank you for having me here. So I'm Dmytro. I'm the head of GRC and security operations at Haken. Actually, I have 8 years in the cybersecurity. I started from the traditional finance with the PCI DSS, and just last 4 years I'm diving with the Web3 security and the CCSS actually.
Awesome. I love seeing how people from different backgrounds all come together in the cryptocurrency digital asset space. I think it's really important when we're innovating something to have a variety of skills. So the reason we're here today is to talk about crypto hacks. There's always a new one. We can't stop them, it seems. But every security incident offers opportunities for us to learn from them. And so we're going to look at what actually happened in a number of different incidents and what organizations and individuals can do to try to mitigate these risks. So we're going to focus on some specific ones, but I know that the hack that's on top of everyone's mind right now is in fact Coldcard. We can't get away from it. We just did a live stream on it last Friday. I'll put a link to it in the comments of this chat or this stream as well. But since this is something that I think most people are talking about, why don't we lead into the rest of the conversation with a little bit on what is going on with Coldcard? Dirk?
Yeah, sure. I think that the Coldcard breach, obviously we have to talk about it right now, even though we did just do that live stream on it because it's basically still active. And what I mean by that is that funds are still being swept out of wallets. Their latest amount I saw was something like 1,800 Bitcoin, which even at today's prices is a fair chunk of money, over 100 million bucks worth of money.
Just a little bit.
Just a fair
chunk. Yeah,
I think that it serves a really important lesson and kind of leads to the rest of the conversation that we're having about these things is that the nature of crypto and the nature of blockchain is that things are permanent, right? Things go onto the blockchain and they are there, right? The records go onto the blockchain, the transactions are recorded on the blockchain. And so this isn't the first time where a hack basically creates a retroactive exposure. Because somebody discovers that there was a flaw in the way that wallets were being seeded and generated, or the keys for wallets were being seeded and generated, and they can go back and find those wallets on the blockchain, right? And move money out of them. And so it's really, really important. I say this a lot in I teach the courses for the crypto, the CCSS auditors and implementers, and it's really important that we do things right the first time in this industry. And I think that's one of the things that differentiates it from a lot of traditional information security, where a good incident response plan can really, potentially mitigate the impact of things. And that's just not always the case in this industry. And not only not the case in this industry, but again, you can go backwards in time, right? Like you can kind of time travel in some of these hacks and go back to wallets that were created years ago, right? I mean, the firmware flaw in the Coldcard wallets was from 2021. That's a few years back now as well, right? And so the ability for people to go back and access those assets now is something that's kind of unique to our space and our industry. So I think it makes talking about some of these other compromises or breaches that we're going to talk about really important. And, kind of from a selfish perspective, kind of highlights, some of the work that we do on the CCSS from the standpoint of trying to do things that will help mitigate these things up front.
Yeah,
I'll
that was
stop.
a really good intro. Well, what other comments does anyone have on the Coldcard incident? Dave?
Yeah, I think, for me personally, I think this one hits a little different than the other ones. These was affecting a community where, for all intents and purposes and optics, they were doing what we were telling them to do. Cold wallets, like these are the most secure things in the world. And it's not that they were engaging with risky protocols or doing some things where they're assuming some of that risk. So this one really feels different than all the other ones. And I do think there's a little bit of blame to be placed on us, honestly, as a whole, because if you take the average consumer and you hear from, when I say us, I don't necessarily mean the collective group here, I just mean the crypto community, when we're shouting, not your keys, not your coins, and really pushing the self-custody. And then there's this feeling of, well, if I keep it on an exchange or I keep it with a provider, it's not really my coins and I don't have ownership of it. And that's not really the right way to hold crypto. And I'm at risk and I'm going to lose all my funds. So it's much better to metaphorically stuff it under my mattress and keep it to myself. And then something like this happens. So I do think we need to reflect a little bit on messaging in some respect, forget the viewpoints of disintermediate and let's not trust the banks and create like that. There's definitely a portion of the crypto community that's probably going to send pitchforks after me for what I'm about to say, but respectfully, a Coinbase, a Robinhood, a BitGo is going to have better security than the average person in their house. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't understand that when they hold your crypto, that maybe you don't actually own it and it's somewhat of an IOU. But when you have these large organizations with established security programs, many of them are publicly traded, so there is a little bit of an oversight from that perspective. They do have charters with the OCC, so there is banking examinations. So you can't look me in the eye and say it's safer for someone who doesn't have any sort of technical experience or true understanding of what they're doing to go keep this funds by themselves than to go trust an organization like that with that level of oversight. So I'm not saying that it's one or the other, but I'm really encouraging most folks to think about this as cash in my wallet, in my pocket that I can buy things with and play around with. But a large portion of your net wealth, theoretically, should be stored with a trusted institution.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that quite a bit in terms of the responsibility that we often place on large institutions. And then we also do this separate thing where we say, well, you'd be safer on your own. But in some cases, that's not actually the case. It depends on skill level, wallets. Are you paying attention to what's happening in the industry? And one of the things I've thought about quite a bit with the Coldcard incident is when we talk about individual users, there's no insurance to back up. If your funds are with a large exchange, then there may be insurance for a certain amount of money. But I feel like I see both sides of it. Dmytro, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I actually wanted to add that this recent incident is something that forced me to think that we definitely need to have the self-custody and the CCSS for the self-custody to be more trendy, right? Because we get used to that the CCSS and the others security frameworks, they're mostly for the company and so on. And so far actually you already you already started to think about it, that you already have the different times of it. You have the service providers, right? You have the full system, and you have the self-custody. So this is something in the space I would like to see, is that the end users will start thinking about their security like more proactively, and also adopt any kind of like not only the Reddit recommendations, right, but only any kind of best practices or the industrial best practices in place as well. So yeah, and another thing is that I wanted to add is like nobody is safe by default, right? No any like manufacturing of any kind of cold wallets, any kind of devices there, and so on. And to be truly like to adopt any kind of like secure practices, you always need to do something above. So there are no any like kind of like defined list of the rules. Just do this, just invest here, just to hold your asset there, and yeah, you would be totally safe there, and so on. And when you start to audit different like entities there, and you're asking them to provide any kind of evidences on or this requirement, and they're telling you like, oh, it's not actually required by the standards, so you are like asking more than it's needed, and so on. So I'm totally surprised about this, right? So always you need to do something about, like, you need to test the entropy by yourself, to have any kind of statistical entropy test there, and so on. Even it's cold wallet, and it's like it's very famous, and so on.
Go ahead, Dirk.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think it's a really interesting perspective. We've often said that, being your own bank is actually hard, right? I mean, when you become your own bank, there's an accountability that goes along with it, and that accountability is to learn and educate yourself. It does, the idea of putting your funds into a centralized institution does fly in the face of the, Bitcoin ethos a bit, because that's kind of the whole idea, right? Is taking out that central person, because that central entity that you upload your crypto to also could like freeze your crypto and, or hand it over to, government somewhere or that sort of thing. So, there's a different set of risks that goes along there. But I think it's absolutely true as well. I do think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of institutions use a lot of these same tools, right? And so could potentially also be vulnerable to the same sorts of attacks that come up here, from time to time, utilizing some of these tools. But they also tend to do things, if they're doing it well, again, if they've got good security design and stuff, they'll have multi-sig, and they'll have a couple of different ways that they're generating keys, not just a single way. And that, that sort of thing, to David's point, really can help protect from these kind of single point of failure type flaws that definitely tend to impact individuals more often.
Yeah. And for those listening who aren't totally familiar with this incident and some of what we're going to talk about later, I think it's important to have a little bit of knowledge about how these keys are generated weekly, and actually how they could be generated in a more strong method. So what I'm talking about is we need to have unguessable numbers when we're discussing cryptographic key material. We need to make sure there's enough entropy, and there's a lot of math that goes into it. So I'm going to hand this over to Michael to explain how it works. Why do we need a lot of entropy or randomness for generating key material, for generating private key material?
Sure, yeah, happy to answer this. So yeah, entropy in its own right is essentially just a measure of how random something is. And so essentially we want something to be super random so that I can't brute force figure out what your seed phrase is. So essentially when you create a wallet, what you're going through is that your system needs to create some source of randomness for you so that you can then generate these recovery phrases and your private key and everything, and it's all based on just some random aspect. Usually this random aspect, the best way it can be done is it's literally gotten through your computer's hardware, uses special things so that it's super random. In fact, the randomness space, I think, is like 2 to the 256. So it's the same as picking a random number out of 1 to the, like anywhere from 0 to 2 to the 256. This is more atoms than we have in the universe. So in general, no one can brute force and figure out what the, what your private key is, or what randomness generated everything that happened. Now, the issue with these exploits are the fact that they used weak randomness. These are randomness that sometimes are used for like online games, etc., because it's not super important there, that you can't brute force them. In these cases, the randomness there sometimes was like 32 bits or something lower than this. so that your space was like 2 to the 200, like 2 to the 32. And this is in like the scope of hundreds of millions. But to a computer, I can run through and iterate through hundreds of millions of things. And in this case, what you do is you do it off chain, and then you find out that, oh, I figured out how to find the private key of this address, and this address has money, so I'm going to take their money, right? So this is the flow.
That was an excellent overview of it. Thank you so much. So we know that what we need is random, unguessable numbers. And we're not talking about like, oh, am I like thinking of a 5 or a 15? We're talking a massive amount of numbers because we have computers that can run through and they keep guessing. So if there's not enough randomness, we have a problem. We know this. This is something that as an industry, we've been talking about for a long time. Our cryptocurrency security standard was developed in 2014, and this is still a problem. This is ongoing. So we just brought up the Coldcard incident, and I think to Dave's point, there is a slightly different feel when talking about hacks or breaches or incidents that directly impact like individuals, especially people who've been in the industry for a long time versus like a company that has insurance or some other way to provide a return of funds to the people who have lost it. In this case, we've got people who are individuals losing a lot of money with Coldcard. So I just think that I want to note that we're all sensitive to the fact that this is real money, real lives. People are really being impacted by it. And so from the technology perspective, we all like to geek out and talk about this. And in some ways it's fun, but the loss of real funds and real people is not fun. So I just want to make sure that anyone who's watching recognizes that we recognize how important that is. But so we'll probably weave in more info about Coldcard as we go, but let's get into some of the other vulnerabilities, which unfortunately some of them have the exact same problem. So let's talk a little bit about the IllBloom vulnerability. So anybody want to start with explaining what the situation was? I mean, spoiler, I just talked about entropy and poor key generation. So that's a good start. But does anyone want to go through what happened with this incident that was in May of this year? And it was disclosed in July of this year. And there's around $5 million confirmed lost because of this vulnerability. I mean, I can keep talking about it. Dirk, do you want to jump in? Okay. Everyone unmuted at the exact same time. Love it. Okay. Go ahead, Dirk.
Yeah, sure. Just real quickly, right? Like you said, it's basically the same issue fundamentally, right? Bloom generated a bunch of wallets and used inadequate entropy from it, and the recovery phrases that they generated became guessable. And so once it was discovered that weak entropy had been used, people started generating those recovery keys and sweeping the funds out of the pre-existing wallets. Again, wallets that predated the discovery of the vulnerability. So unlike, traditional vulnerabilities where you tend to think, oh, they discover a vulnerability and then they hack into the bank and steal the money, right? In this case, they're stealing money from the old transactions, the things that had already happened. So yeah, again, just emphasizing the importance of having good, secure key generation procedures and testing them, which was something that it comes up in class a lot. And I was actually going to throw Michael under the bus here for a second as a mathematician, student of mathematics. One of the things that comes up a lot is how do you test that, right? Like how does an auditor go in and test entropy? How do you, as like a business owner, right? How do you go in and test entropy? So how do you verify that you actually are getting good entropy? Because again, the human brain looks at a whole bunch of numbers and goes, yeah, there's a whole bunch of numbers there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Michael, do you want to answer that now, or should we come back to after we've done a little more discussion around what happened with IllBloom? Either way is fine.
Let's come back to me in a second.
Okay, perfect. I was going to say, I think it does make sense to discuss a little bit more about like the malware side of things, and then we'll get into that. But so for the malware, we're talking about somebody that had this information on their computer, right? And they were able to access the keys from the computer. That's what happened with this Ilbloom, I'm talking about the humanity. We're talking about the attackers being able to get the keys from weak entropy. Actually, I just want to point out
equipped than an individual. So I think that's two different problem statements here. Organizations can solve this, I don't want to say fairly easily, but not to borrow boring, nomenclature from, my world, but it's third-party risk management, right? If you're going to be purchasing hardware, if you're going to be engaging with a vendor, you have to think through like what is the universe of risks, and one of those is randomness. So one of the things that you would be looking for is how are they certifying their entropy and how are they doing their own testing? Are they bringing in a Trail of Bits or a Kudelski or an NCC or one of the cryptographic auditing firms to to make sure that they're following certain things? There's frameworks like the CCSS to make sure that they are checking the box, if you will, in some cases, to make sure that we're thinking through the things that we should be thinking through. So organizations have the staff and have the wherewithal to understand the universe of risks and then develop a program in order to make sure that the suppliers that they're purchasing for or using are meeting those level of standards.
Right. And you could do everything possible right. But if you started at the beginning with keys that can be easily determined, then all of the other things after that don't matter. And I think sometimes we talk about like risk management and things like that. It's like, oh, this is boring. Well, it's not boring when you get to the point where we've got millions, billions of dollars, vanishing, not going to the right people. That's
right. But when I say boring, outside of, GSIBs and financial services, when you start talking about vendor risk management and third-party risk management, many times, and I've seen it's incredibly performative and theater-based. It is, let me do the thing so I can check the box to give the illusion that I'm actually managing my risk from a supplier perspective, but you're not actually doing anything. I can't tell you how many people I know will ask for a SOC 2 report, not even open it, and just file it away. So that way they can show their auditors, look, I got a SOC 2 report. Did you open it? Do you understand how to read it? Do you understand how to question your vendor on it? I'll open it up sometimes and I'll look at the auditing firm and I'll say, this is a very much a purchase a SOC 2, type of a shop. Or I've had some vendors where here's a perfect example of like understanding how to read the report versus not read the report. I was evaluating a vendor. They send the SOC 2 and it's a type 1. And I asked them, like, that's strange because I know like the previous year you had a type 2. So why did you go from a type 2 to a type 1? And if you're not familiar with the terminology, type 2 is testing the effectiveness of the controls over a period of time. And a type 1 is just the design of the control itself, but not whether or not it's operating effectively. So for everyone listening, this organization went from, we've been testing our controls for an entire year, and now all of a sudden I'm giving you a report that goes back towards just check to make sure that the controls are designed properly. So I asked them, what exactly happened? Can you give me your previous SOC 2 type 2 so I can see maybe there's new controls? Like I want to understand. All of a sudden I see that the auditing firm switched. So then I asked them, I said, well, that's curious. You switched your auditing firm and now you're going back to a type 1. That signals to me that they found something really bad and you did not want to publish that report. So you fixed a couple of things. You can't do a type 2 now because there's something that was missing or broken. And then you brought in a new firm. So I decided not to move forward with that firm. But that's an example of actually doing third-party risk management versus can I have your SOC 2 so I can file it away and give my thumbs up to the auditors that I'm doing a good job from a TPRM perspective. The tools are there for us. The signal is there for us. Many organizations just do not take this thing seriously.
Dmytro, I'm going to go to you next. I just want to say, Dave, I was on a call earlier today and I actually used the phrase security theater and said that I learned it from you. So anyways, that terminology about the performative nature of security is, I feel like, a really useful way to explain what's going on the front end to conceal sometimes what's happening on the back end. And Dmytro, what were you going to jump in about?
Yeah, actually, if you would think from the individual's perspective, I believe like, yeah, for sure, we can go and try to move forward proactively here. But more likely when such incidents happen and so on, we have no any other options, but just to react to such incident. And it's another like quite interesting thing to have any kind of like K-compromise protocol, right? We have this in the CCSS. But yeah, we can call it like the incident response plan, the disaster recovery, and any others like stuff like this. But the main idea is pretty basic, like what you will do if something would happen. And you just need to try to imagine what can happen. Will you have an access to your like wallet in any of the any kind of disaster cases there? So I believe like if you would be actually lucky and if you see that the kind of bad trends are happening like this, right? So maybe you would be so lucky actually to react to this properly, to move your funds from your the old wallets like this to the any kind of like safe substitute for it. And when I actually started one of the course from the Patrick related to the wallet security, so it was quite interesting that he also recommended to have any kind of disaster recovery drill, even for the individuals. And one of the like option how you can to do it is just to open your Google Calendar, and each 6 months you have any kind of reminder that you need to check, like, do you still have access to your wallets, like how many times it's needed there and so on, because like the hacks in cryptos and the incidents in crypto, they could be pretty fast. Like sometimes you have 10 minutes, sometimes you have hours and so on. So for the individuals, it's one of the, I believe the best advice is actually to have your fingers on your pulse and to check the situation, and sometimes to train yourself, like what you will do.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like a personal incident response. If this happens, what do you do? And one of the things on our stream about Coldcard last week was, I believe Jameson Lopp said this, like, he's like, I'm not saying that funds should always be on exchanges, but in this case, he basically said it makes sense to quickly move it somewhere else rather than be trying to figure out how to regenerate keys. Just make a decision, move into a safer place, and then if you want to generate keys again personally, you do it then. So I think that there is a time for different things, but in general, having like what kind of response you personally or as an organization are going to have to an incident, no one works well under pressure like that, especially when we've got a lot of money at stake. So yeah, absolutely. I do want to go back to the question that Dirk asked Michael before, because I think it's a good way to, before we move into the next thing, and I think it was a good question, Dirk. But so, Michael, how do we check for entropy, either as an individual or an organization? Are we all just screwed? I hope you say no. What are we supposed to do other than cry?
I mean, so the main source comes down to just identifying where your source of randomness is coming from, and because it's essentially your source of randomness, however big that space is how safe that you are. And so the easiest way that everyone in an organization, you don't need mathematics, you don't need anything, it's just going down to the libraries and figuring out what random function are you using to generate the randomness that you are then using to generate further things. So in this case, like in the cold wallet case, and in fact in this Bloom case, it's the fact that they were using a library that had a fault in it that was using a pseudo-random function. And by pseudo-random, it means that it's not really suitable for like true randomness. It's not big enough. And so that is why you could iterate through all these sorts of spaces. So the main thing that you should do is that you should go look at your random function, and then you should verify that it's giving you at least 128 bits of security. And like this is like the bare minimum everyone wants. Usually you want 256 bits of randomness, but one has to be pretty careful about how you go about this because I mean, in fact, in the Bloom case as well, I think the issue is the fact that it ended up getting converted into 128 bits or 256 bits, something like this. So it looked like it was safe if you just looked at the output because it output 128 bits. But the problem is the actual inputs that you put into the generator didn't encompass a full 128 bits. So even though it generated something that was 128 bits, the randomness source, the inputs that you provided, didn't have enough bits to make the space large enough that you can't iterate through it. So the best thing that you can do that any person can do is if you're using one of these libraries, go through the libraries and make sure that you're using an approved version that's giving you enough randomness that you need, namely, and then beyond that as well, as we can see, even some of these libraries had these flaws where we didn't see them. Go back and check for yourself. Look at the inputs and see, are the inputs taking up at least 128 bits or not? If they're not, then you are probably, I mean, maybe if you're at 120, you could get by, but you should just check at these inputs as they will tell you essentially how random your random number is going to end up being, and then essentially how hard it's going to be for me to brute force it. And as I said, you need minimum 128 bits to essentially say I can't brute force it. 256 makes it virtually impossible. So that's why that's the industry standards.
Okay, and now I'm going to move over to Dave, and this is where I feel like it gets interesting because we're talking about math, and I think sometimes we're like math, it's clear, but there are different opinions on this a bit as well. Dave, jump in.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm smirking here because I feel like that's a great clip that we can put out there to be like, this is why 99.9% of the population is not in crypto. Because like what you just said, 99.999% of the population is like, I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to verify that. So I think that's a problem that we need to solve in the community is, if you want people to hold on to things themselves, they're going to need something to help them to hold on to those things, which are wallets, which means there's a trust in the institution or the vendor that are creating these things. And I think it all comes back to frameworks and standards and auditing firms. So I think like the answer comes back to more around figuring out like that trusted stamp of approval, whether it's that CCSS audit or whether that's, an independent attestation from an auditing firm on the cryptographic library. But when we keep going down this rabbit hole of it's so easy. I've had, some moronic conversations with folks around, trusted execution environments itself. It's like, oh, well, you can very easily stand up the entire repo and get the measurements yourself. And I'm like, no one's doing that. You can say you can do that, but no one does that. Same thing with open source repos. It's like, well, I can just do a SAS and DAS scanning and check for no one does that either. So we have to figure out like, yes, there's disintermediate, and yes, there's decentralization, and yes, there's debank, but there's still going to have to be some level of trust somewhere with somebody or some organizations, whether it's trusting, C4 that the CCSS audit is really well thought out, whether it's trusting the Kadelskis, the NCCs of the world from getting cryptographic audits. Like we're shouting trust list, but there's some pockets of trust that we have to be okay with.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. And I think to the point, like what Michael said, yes. And how, like we're on this call, we all understood what he was saying, but I like that you brought that up, Dave, because I think it is a really difficult thing. I remember when I first got into crypto, learning the difference between asymmetric and symmetric cryptography. And like that now seems so obvious to me, but at the time it was not obvious. When I first studied for the CBP exam, I like had all of these notes to try to figure it out and understand it. And now it's like, I just know it. But I think a lot of people want to get into crypto, but they don't have those technical skills. So some of them go the trusted route of institutions, and some want to kind of play around a little bit. And the minimizing of trust, but still needing to have that piece of it, I think is really important. Dirk, did you want to add to that?
No, I think that's all valid stuff, right? I mean, there's tools out there for, testing randomness, but they're not the tools that your average user is going to use, and a lot of times doesn't even have the access. Like if you buy a hardware wallet that just has, built-in functions for key generation, right? You don't have the ability really to see the output like Michael was talking about and test that randomness yourself. So you're trusting that hopefully somebody did it and that they didn't do something stupid afterwards, right? Because like Michael said, right, you can generate what appears to be a certain amount of entropy or a certain amount of randomness. But it isn't really because of how you generated it, and we've seen this happen after the fact, people throw away half of it, right? They truncate it, or they get rid of half of the randomness before they actually generate the keys, and so they didn't actually do what they said they were doing. So yeah, it's a complicated problem. It's a hard problem, and it's a very hard problem to fix on your own. And so at some point, like David said, right, you can trust a centralized entity, you can trust a product, which really means you're trusting the manufacturer of that product, which is also a centralized entity. Or you can go back to running your own, Bitcoin node and generating keys, but then they're online keys. And, it is a complex and not easy to solve problem, I think was where it was trying to get at. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Michael brought up 128 bits. We can just, this is all the math you'll get from me today. I believe it was 72 bits used, and we're talking about 128. So, we can, even those who aren't into math and cryptography are able to figure out that there wasn't enough entropy. There weren't enough bits. There's an issue. So, okay, we've talked about the key material side of things in terms of generating, but sometimes you can do everything right with generating and there's still a problem. And sometimes the issues that come from this seem so basic, but they're not basic. They're well, maybe they are basic, but they cause huge catastrophes, I would say. So the next example I want to talk about of a recent hack is what happened with the Humanity Protocol, which was in June of this year, 2026, and it was about $36 million. But the interesting piece is that this is related to malware on a developer's computer. Dave, will you explain what malware is?
Malware is just software that's run on a PC that just has a malicious purpose. So software, swap out the soft, change it to mal for malicious. So malware.
Okay, so we've got keys saved on a computer, on a desktop. What could malware, or in this case, what did malware do? How did this happen?
Yeah.
How can somebody get access? If you put your private keys on your computer and are like, here we go, I'm all set.
Yeah,
Why
I mean, we
aren't you?
all, on a desktop, developer, engineer, anybody, we're all downloading things, we're all running software, whether it's Adobe Acrobat, or whether it's Microsoft Word, or whether it's Claude, or just any piece of software that you're running on your machine. It's running with a certain level of privileges to see files that are on that machine. And in this case, this was malware, again, malicious software that was running, or this person was tricked into installing on their machine. And once it was running on that machine, it had access to the files that were on that machine, and they had keys on that machine, and then those keys were exfiltrated and then used to effectuate the stealing of the crypto.
It's pretty scary, and I'm glad you brought up the point where we're all downloading things often. We're all downloading different SDKs. There's always something that we need to be doing. So how can we make sure we're being careful? There are a couple other ways this could have been mitigated, but do we have any general advice, like what people should be aware of when they're updating or downloading things?
Yeah, I mean, listen, there's tons of observability and tools that could be placed at the network layer, at the desktop level, whether you're using a CrowdStrike or SentinelOne, you're scanning stuff at the network level. There's whitelisting applications depending on the level of rigor you want. Like if you're working in a large regulated financial service organization, every piece of software is going to have to be reviewed and approved before it can get installed on a desktop. That's preferable from a security perspective, somewhat untenable for projects and individuals to kind of, you're not going to individually test every single piece of binary executable. But what I would say, what went wrong here isn't that they installed software. It was that there was just the key sitting on the desktop. Like whenever, again, going back to how I evaluate vendors, I don't start off conversations with vendors with, tell me about your SDLC process or tell me about this. I throw scenarios at them because it does two things for me. One, it helps me understand how they think. And two, they give stories about their control. So one of the questions I always ask my vendors is, if one of your critical engineers gets owned, walk me through the controls that you have in place to stop the exfiltration of my data or the stealing of the keys. So if you ask this individual, if you get owned, what's stopping the key? The answer obviously was nothing. So that type of questioning would kind of unsurface the fact that there was not 10 levels of controls that were protecting the keys from the desktop.
Yeah, Dmytro, do you want to add on?
Yeah, I also wanted to highlight the thing is that like not only the storage location and the malware was the problem, right? But the problem also was like the one point of failure. So even if the case, for example, would be stored like in the different accounts in the AWS, right? Like geographically separate and so on, but you still have the one person who had the access everywhere there. Even the malware would be like in any other like types and so on, your session could be hijacked and so on. And the answer for it is like the proper risk management there. So you don't need to have the one point of failure, and you don't need to have a person with the excessive privileges to like lots of your keys, even like this, right? And another thing about it is like what I really like is that this is actually the core of the information security, to have the risk management, right? And to be a business aligned. And to be a business aligned, you need to have the proper risk management, so you understand how many you invest in your security. And for me, like it's quite interesting that I had a case when I started an audit for one of the companies, and they had no any gap assessment prior and against of the CCSS requirements there, but they conducted the risk management so well. So when I came in there, there's no lots of to do there, not a lots of to guide there and so on. And it's not because like they're know all of the frameworks, industry like best practices and so on. This is because they conducted the proper risk management. They understand what they are doing, their infrastructure and so on. And for this type of companies, the CCSS would be mostly a badge and evidences of this industry best practices. And it is something that I would like to see in every entities, that they're starting not with adoption of the exact frameworks, but from the risk management, right? So this is something that I would like to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Dirk, did you want to jump in?
I think, again, Dmytro kind of hit on what I was going to mention there, right? Which is the fact that you don't actually have multi-sig if all the keys are sitting in one place and controlled by one device or one person, right? But you don't even bother setting up multi-sig if that's what you're going to do, right? Because you fundamentally don't have it. Yeah, another one of the big flaws here, just that the malware was able to get all those keys because they were all sitting in one place.
Yeah, security theater. We've got a multi-sig setup. Do you? Go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, what's interesting for me is I've had conversations with many organizations that have this kind of, pardon my language, really just poor and shitty setup. And what I find really interesting is the engineers don't disagree with the possibility that blank can happen. They just don't think it will. So it's not a lack of understanding of that this is a bad idea. They just think that it's never going to happen to them. Because again, I worked with, and I know many organizations that will have all of their keys literally sitting in GitHub or Notion or Google Drives and Google Docs. And when you bring up the scenarios, you get a lot of eye rolls and you get a lot of these things are not going to happen. And it's going to cause too much friction. And, I want to develop a product and I don't want to actually stand up an entire key management system. So it's not a technical conversation with the engineers and business to get them to understand. I think we're losing them on these things actually do happen and we're not just running around saying the sky is falling.
It's so interesting though, because the sky is falling. It keeps falling. Michael, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, just to point out to this, it's because, we all get complacent, I think, with security. And I think one of the most important things, and at least that I've seen as I've been growing in the space, is just that these IT drills and stuff that you go through help you see that these attacks can happen to you. Phishing is something that, I think a lot of us know what the PH phishing is, and we think, oh, okay, great, of course, I won't click on a malicious email link, obvious, no problems. But they haven't actually gone through a targeted phishing attack where they're targeting them. It's what if you had a message from your CEO that was just a quick thing and your company was close to being at IPO or something like this, and you got an email saying that the CEO needed you to sign something so that you could have a non-disclosure about this. And then, of course, you would get excited. You click the link without knowing this sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, you're compromised. So it's one of those, if you think that you know better than these phishing schemes, you probably don't. I think everyone can fall for them. So
I totally agree. I think it can happen to anyone.
Yeah, just a quick note here. What I found has worked in the past is many organizations are super familiar with pen tests. Again, some of it is theater. We have to get a pen test. Let's go get a pen test. But many organizations don't know the difference between a pen test and a red team exercise and don't actually do them. And I think if many organizations, again, they're super expensive and they could take a long time, but just doing a red team exercise, and again, for those listening who don't know the difference, pen test is let me check this web app to see if there's any vulnerabilities. A red team exercise is more objective based. Go steal my crypto. And then they come back in 6 months and they're like, we did it and here's how. And they'll use, every TTP that's out there, whether it's, creating custom malware and dropping, and again, this is all safe exercises, but dropping malware in an internal Slack channel and an engineer accidentally clicks it and then they're owned. And again, it's all done with the sign off from executive leadership that this op is going on internally within an organization. But I've been involved with and seen some really amazing red team exercises where it's they come back 3 months later and they're like, here's the keys. We were able to move, crypto, and it's super interesting. And when that happens, you get a lot more buy-in from senior leadership than just, oh, there was a, CVS, whatever 9 vulnerability and, but if they're like, hey, we were able to steal crypto, we were able to steal social security numbers, they perk up a little bit more.
Yeah, and Dave, you mentioned TTP, so that's tactics, techniques, procedures.
Yep.
And so we're talking about something where this isn't just oh, I think I'm gonna go fishing. This is dedicated, intentional attacks. These things go on for a long time. We've got state actors involved. This isn't someone just randomly being like, hee. I mean, it might be, I'm going to send a link, but these are like really well thought out situations. And that's why, like Michael, when you said it can happen to anyone, basically, and I think it does because they're so good at this. Dirk?
Yeah, I was just going to add kind of on a tangent to that. When David mentioned that, the engineers and stuff will, and not just engineers, but executives and everybody else, right, will just be like, well, yeah, I understand that could happen, but the likelihood of it happening to me goes back, I think, to what Dmytro was talking about earlier, right? And like proper risk assessment, proper risk management procedures as well, right? Because a lot of times, yeah, they really haven't thought about the likelihood of something happening, right? And exactly what that impact of that would look like, in their environment if it did. So going back to fundamentals of risk assessment, risk management to make those sorts of evaluations instead of just somebody arbitrarily being like, yeah, but we don't really need to do that. Right. Having just individuals making those sorts of decisions instead of a process.
Yeah, you bring up a great point, risk assessment. The way that when I've been a CISO, the way I view my role as a CISO is in some cases like a lawyer. I provide counsel. It's not my business. I'm not making a decision on behalf of the business that this is a good decision or this is a bad decision. I'm giving you my opinion. I'm giving you my counsel. If you choose to ignore me, great. You're accepting the risk, slide a piece of paper over, and I want this document. And again, it's not for a CYA, it's proper risk management is that you are accepting a risk and you put a timeline on it. We'll accept the risk for 6 months while we develop compensating controls, or we'll reevaluate in 6 months when we have more money to spend to tackle a particular problem. There's nothing wrong with risk assessments, and it's a powerful tool in a proper risk management strategy. But the lack of documentation and the revisiting of just this constant cycle of accepting things because it won't happen is what leads towards, well, I wasn't aware that blank happened. Well, we did. We had a conversation 4 months ago and I told you to do blank. I wasn't really fully cognizant of the actual impact of the organizations. But it's just proper risk management. It's not CYA.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So we're actually running short. This always happens. There's always so much to talk about with hacks. I came up with a list of so many hacks and I'm like, we're never going to be able to cover all of these. And we've done 3 streams now, and this is going to be on an ongoing series. But another one we wanted to talk about was what happened with Gnosis Pay. We don't have to get into all the details about it exactly, but I think what's important is that you can have vulnerabilities to your system based upon software that you're using, other programs that you're using, APIs. You're connecting to a lot of different things. And so when we talk about risk management, we're also talking about paying attention to risks that are brought in through other, like supply chain, other companies that are interacting with your company's products or services as well. So how do we look at this from an angle where it's not just internal, right? We're getting external vulnerabilities or internal vulnerabilities, but then there's also, we're intentionally connecting to this company or product, and now we've introduced this other vulnerability. How do we know if they're doing the right things, their own due diligence and risk management?
You can't fully, to be completely candid, right? There's always going to be a little bit of opaqueness and black box when you're working with vendors. There's only so much diligence you can do. You're going to look at their audits, you're going to look at their SOC 2s, you're going to look to make sure that they're following, the recommended frameworks. But there's always going to have to be somewhat a level of trust within a vendor. So like personally, what I do is I look at how important or how paramount is this particular piece of software or functionality within what I'm trying to build. If it is of such importance that I just don't feel comfortable relying on a vendor, and it doesn't have to even be for security, it could be for resiliency, it could be a ton of other reasons. So then you start thinking through, well, is this something that I can create compensating controls for from a security perspective, whether encrypting before it leaves my boundary? There are things that you can properly think through, but I think it goes beyond TPRM. Like TPRM is like the baseline of, is this vendor doing certain things? But then you also have to look at it through the lens of like, what are they actually doing for me and where does it fit within my stack? And is this a level of risk that I feel comfortable taking on, or is this something that I want to potentially build myself? Like sometimes it does come down to a buy versus build analysis also.
Yeah, Dmytro, what is your perspective on this as well?
Yeah, for the actually software supply attacks, and that is kind of like when you have a dependency on of any kind of like external software on the libraries that you are downloading and so on. For sure, like there's no the easy way to monitor all of the libraries and the models you are downloading, updating, patching there, and so on. For sure, you can like set up a proper monitoring for the versioning, for the like OS dependency checks there, and yeah, there are lots of the stuff that you can monitor there. They would produce alerts, but yeah, there also needs a lot of the time to monitor all of this stuff, to react on it, to like having any kind of rollback procedures if you find any kind of issue there. But also, in parallel, we are speaking about the actual the critical functionalities there, right? So if you're speaking about the finance, about the funds and the crypto, I'm more than sure that there would be the case to avoid it. Actually, if set up a proper monitoring there and properly checking what exact library you're using into your any kind of critical infrastructure. But also, I was interested to admit that they actually reacted to this incident, right? So they identified the event, they identified it, they isolated it, they stopped their card services there, and so on. And this is actually something that sometimes is very lacking in the industry to have a proper monitoring, to have the detection tools, and so on. For example, if you're talking about the regulations in the DORA, right? This is the like Digital Operations Resilience European Act, and they're actually writing that you need to have detection tools to automate in automated way to detect any kind of possible incident there, right? And this is exact option is very manipulative in the crypto space, right? There's a lack of the like on-chain monitoring in place implemented there, and the regulators sometimes they are not checking it because they are not truly like industry like specifically experts in these exact topics. And but yeah, right now I believe that in the crypto you need to generate keys, you need to store it securely, and then you need to have a proper crypto specific tools actually to also to monitor what functions are used, is your wallet started to drain it there, and so on. Because if it's not automatically set it up manually, you will never react on this incident. And this is because of the crypto native space that we have like 10 minutes and all of the wallets empty, right? So this is the one point that I want to bid that they actually did a good job that they identified this, they localized this, and they reacted. So this is also the good one.
Yeah, Gnosis Pay reacted quickly. We don't always see this happening. And sometimes there's nothing that can be done, right? Like you can react as quickly as possible, but if it's done, it's done. But in this case, that they did respond in a more prompt way than I think we often see. So yeah, that's important. Okay, so we're going to talk about the Ostium situation as well. We'll do that on a future stream. Like I said, there's always just so many different examples. So Dirk,
Jess,
we'll just keep, yeah, please, Dirk, jump
I
in.
was going to say real quick before we move on, in regard to both Dmytro and David's comments there, I think it's really important also to understand, when it comes to looking at these like libraries and modules and resources that get used in development, especially in like smart contracts and key management systems, that again, there's an ethos in the crypto space, right? About kind of like, openness and not centralized, shying away from centralized. And so lots of open source stuff gets used, right? And so there's no company to like, say, hey, have you done your due diligence? There's no like resource to go ask that stuff for. So if you're not testing it yourself, it's not tested, right? It's not validated unless you're actually, when you bring in code libraries and stuff like that into your tools, you have to be doing the testing of those things when they come from open source repositories, because otherwise they're just not tested and you don't know.
Great point. And, again, a lot of those tools, the commercial ones, are really, really expensive. So that's why a lot of this stuff goes really unchecked, because it comes down towards, do I want to spend, a couple $1 million budget in commercial software to do all of my scanning? Yes, there's some great open source scanning as well, but that's kind of doubling down on the problem because no one's necessarily maintaining those as well. So a lot of this stuff just goes unchecked.
Yeah, when you're talking about that, Dirk, I was thinking about how, like, okay, so you'll know I have dogs based on this, but so you're outside walking in the yard, you walk in, you check your shoes. There's like a very clear thing to see, did I step in crap on my way in? But with the security stuff, you don't actually know if you did always. You're not tracking in. There's not like a smell test. Instead, it's really expensive. There's all of these things you need to go through in order to make sure you didn't step in it. And so we've got this massive problem. And I think what I've heard from a lot of security professionals is that there's not always the money to do this, or there's not always the company culture that this is important. And so asking for help, getting additional services, or just increasing a budget overall is not always the first priority. Instead, the priority is marketing, shipping the product, rather than, I think, what people on this call would think is the most important thing.
Yeah, you mentioned culture. You want to cause a shitstorm in crypto? Tell all your crypto engineers you're putting MDM on their devices, so that way it's the antithesis. So all of the controls that we have in regulated financial service to ensure you have this proper boundary from an edge perspective, they'll walk out the door if you mention that you're going to be installing these things.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, what other last bits of information does anyone want to talk about in terms of recent crypto hacks, what we should be aware of, anything we've covered? We've got a couple minutes left for us to do our kind of final goodbyes.
I would just throw in that there are answers to all of this stuff, right? There are, we've talked about a lot of them, but there are methods and procedures out there to address an awful lot of this stuff, right? There's always going to be, security is never perfect. There's always going to be little things out there, but a lot of the stuff that happens that results in these could have been avoided. And so it's not a matter of live in fear because there is no good way forward, right? That there are, in fact, ways to address these things.
Look at you giving us a little bit of positivity and hope at the end of the stream. I love that, because there are things we can do, and it's about being smart, using our resources the way that we can, and accepting that there's always some risk. You can't mitigate all risks. It's impossible, but you can be aware of what those risks are and react appropriately. Go ahead, Dave.
I'll jump in next. Just to kind of dovetail off of that, like, there are solutions to all these problems. Not to bring AI into the conversation with the last 2 minutes, but one of my favorite sound bites that I gave once during an interview was like, is AI, creating all of this mess? And the answer is like, no, it's just allowing the threat actors to find the shitty designs quicker. So, back to Dirk's point is like, you designed it like, it was a shit design to begin with, and people are taking advantage of your design. We do have the answers. Like, it's just people are taking shortcuts, or they're not hiring the right people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, so for those watching, if you're like, how do I align in a way that is safer with at least key management? There's a reason our security standard is free for anyone to look at, because we want you to use it. Even if you as a company aren't getting certified or going through an official audit, some information is better than no information. And it's good to use the resources that have been created by experts. And we hope that you'll do so. I put a link to the standard in the chat earlier. It's also going to be in the description. Go ahead.
And just a call back to the earlier point, exactly what you just said. Even if it's not relevant to you as an individual, look for organizations that have gone through that audit. Because like, you can go to the website and find CCSS certified, solutions. So like, use that as a way to identify who you're going to be using.
Yes, absolutely. So, okay, we are at time. So I want to thank our guests, Dave, Michael, Dirk, Dmytro, who had to leave early. And we just appreciate you so much for being here, helping educate people. And for those watching, thank you. We hope that today's discussion gives you a better understanding of not only what happened with some of these hacks, but also how we can build stronger and more resilient cryptocurrency systems moving forward and stop the madness. So please like and subscribe so we can continue to share unbiased educational content with you. And thank you for joining, and we will see you next time. Thank you.